Right, thank you. Well, welcome everyone to this session. Thank you for being here. It's quite amazing to see a crowded room for what could possibly be rather a dry topic. So my name's Simon. I'm lucky enough to be an instructor. I'm part of the Trailhead Academy team based here in London in the UK. And my job is to do technical training, mostly on the core platform for developers. So the likes of Apex, Lightning Components, Flows, I'm sure you've heard of Flow, APIs, that kind of thing. And this topic here is one that really I think I'd suggest that anybody who's building things on this platform, whether you are a developer or actually also an admin where you're trying to understand, and maybe I should have put a subtitle here, what the hell is going on, this might help a little bit, I'm hoping. So I'm getting stuck into this. I haven't got very long. I was going to do an actual demo and everything, but because not too long here, 40 minutes, I decided not to risk it. So it's just slides, but we'll try and put some color to this. I'm going to give you a little scenario here. So I'm a trainer. I deliver courses, a number of them, and they have particular deliveries. So if this was a course that we're doing today, that would be perhaps if I was capturing this in Salesforce, I would record that in a custom object, maybe called course, and all sorts of interesting information like duration and whatever. And this particular delivery on this day, I would perhaps capture that in a structure like this with a little delivery object. So I'd have a couple of objects maybe in Salesforce with a relationship between them. This one happens to be a master detail relationship. We draw those in red typically. So a very simple data model. Some automation is on these things. So on the bottom one here, I've got an Apex trigger. Happens to be written in Apex. Could have probably done it in Flow. Happens to be written in Apex. That makes sure that we don't schedule a delivery on a public holiday. It's never a popular thing to do something like that, right? And also maybe a workflow rule. Remember those? They still exist. That might create a task. If we schedule a new course or delivery, we might want to tell someone about it. And on the top one here, some other automation, to look to see, well, maybe we want to retire a course, maybe we want to cancel it. In that case, we need to make sure that we deal with any sort of scheduled deliveries, let's cancel them. So some automation on the top one that will mess around with the delivery records underneath there. So let's speculate that I do come along. I want to retire a particular course. It's not very, it's not very popular. Nobody cares. We're wasting our time with it. Let's get rid of it. So that's our simple data model, our simple scenario here. So I want to throw a few things at you. Here's a screenshot. Sorry about the screenshots. This is a course record. This is one. Let's speculate. It's boring. Nobody cares anymore. It's currently active. It's got some scheduled deliveries here. One's been delivered, one's scheduled in the future, but nobody's signed up. We realize we're wasting our time with this particular training course. So what we do here is I come along and I set that to retired. So my automation, which is running on this little puppy up here, kicks in and says, okay, you're retiring this course. I need to go down and have a look at those two deliveries, and I need to maybe change their status. Now, actually, this is a scenario we give to our Apex developers when we train them. So there's a number of things wrong here. One of these, I don't know if you spotted it, we had one that had been delivered, and we just changed it to cancelled. Dumb move. Okay, so if you were Apex developers, I would make you figure out how to fix that, because we've messed up the code deliberately here, honestly. So we do that, okay? And they're both cancelled. Now, if I capture a log file here, remember developer console, good old developer console. We love developer console. We're looking at a debug log. I don't know how many of you have had the pleasure of looking at system debug logs on the core platform. Has it been a happy time for you if you've done that? It's not for me. But one of the things that developer console can do for you, if you ask it nicely, and you're not too frightened by this horrible screen here, is it will give you this sort of save order. It will give you, hopefully, a little rough view of what went on in that transaction. When I click the save button, when I changed that course from active to retired, my automation kicked in. I can see some stuff happened. I can see, for example, that I had my trigger on this top guy here, happens to be an Apex trigger, which started doing stuff. It wanted to go to those 2 child records and started, changing them. So I can see, here's a course delivery. Yeah, there was a trigger on this guy down here, the bottom one. That fine. Now, that's not doing very much. It's just checking to see, well, are you scheduling a delivery on a holiday? Obviously, we're not, so it really did nothing, but it still ran. We looked at a workflow rule. That workflow rule was configured to run only when we're creating a record. So the system would have detected that the workflow rule and says, do I need to run this thing? Oh, no, not really, because it only runs when you're creating a record. But then here's the kicker. I got this trigger on this top one, this guy here, it ran again. Why did that happen? What the hell is going on here? I can take the hit for this one over here on the left-hand side, because that's me saving, modifying that course record, just changing the status. But why did it run a second time? And actually, again, particularly badly designed code, but I can see for the other delivery record, there were 2 of them. I've got exactly the same thing. So that automation on the parent object ran 3 times here. I only expect it to run once. Why is that? What on earth is going on here? It could be, but that's not happening here. No, those are very simple automation, so it's not my automation that's screwing things up here. Any other guesses? You'd have to be pretty good to spot it. I went through it pretty quick here. It's because that is a master-detail relationship. What do we know about master-detail relationships? One of the things we can do with them, we can put certain type of field on the parent object, roll-up summary fields. We're actually causing roll-up summary fields to be recalculated and saved. So when that happened, the automation on my parent here, my master record, that ran again. So I want to try and give you a tool that you might use, it depends on whether you like it or not, to help you understand this and help you draw it out. So we want to talk about the order of execution, the save order of execution. It's all about the journey these days. You've seen reality TV. It's all about the journey. Somebody comes along, presses the save button, creating a record, updating it, deleting it, undeleting it. There's a journey that your data makes from screen to database. Now, at a minimum, and we use this circular graphic here to represent this, and these little blobs, they're not random, they mean stuff, and I'm just going to go through them, hopefully fairly quickly, to do this. But at a minimum, you need to understand that when you are saving a record in Salesforce, it's kind of like a 2-step thing. At some point, your data is actually written to the Salesforce database here on this save step, but it is not committed. Commit happens right at the end. So until that commit happens, no changes that are visible outside the scope of this order of execution. So Simon comes along, saves a record, it goes through that circular graphic there. We hit the save point. If we were all sharing the same org, none of the rest of you are going to know what I'm doing until we get to that commit point. Okay. So that's the first thing to get into your head. And the second thing is, well, where can we put automation into this? So the popular ones today are Apex triggers, and also record-triggered flows. And for both of those, you have the ability to sort of inject them either before that save step happens, so-called before triggers. I think for flows we call them, marketing decided to call them fast field updates. And after the save, so-called after triggers, which marketing decided to call flows, actions and related records, I think. But 2 points where we can inject automation, either using Apex or using record-triggered flows. Now, they have typical use cases, particularly for Apex, it's just code, so you can pretty much do anything you darn well like. But typically, a before trigger It's most often used for, if it's Apex validation. I know you've got custom validation rules, but they're formula-based. So if you want something a bit sexier, before save Apex trigger is your friend. Or they can use to modify the inbound data. You want to mess with what the users typed in on the screen there. So you can have a lot of fun with your users. You know, I swear to God I did this, but that's what ended up in the database. So before triggers, both flows and Apex can change the data. And really, just at the moment with Apex, you can do the validation. We can't quite yet do that gracefully with a record-triggered flow. The after ones, they tend to be used if you want to do things with related records. You know, you're creating an account record maybe. You want to create a child of that account record. What do you need to know about the account record if you're going to create a relationship to it? What's the most important field you need to know? The ID. The ID gets generated at that save step. So if you want to do anything related, you've got to do it after the save, certainly on an insert, not before, because otherwise you've got no ID. You're kind of stuffed there. So let's go through this circular graphic here. Let's imagine we're coming along and we're saving a record. I'm going to look at this from the perspective maybe even inserting a new record or updating an existing one, because that's the most complex. Same thing for delete and undelete, but less complex. So come along. First thing we do is, if it's an update, we need to identify the original record. We load the original record. So who's done flow here? Who's done record-triggered flows? What are the popular global variables that flow uses? There's two of them. Sorry? Record and record prior. $record and $record underscore prior. Yeah. This is where on a flow, $record underscore prior gets the goodies. Okay? If it's an Apex code, trigger.old. Then we load the field values from the request, the new stuff that you maybe typed in at the screen. So in a flow, that's where $record gets the goodies. In Apex code, trigger.new gets populated. And if the request is coming from the UI, we will do things like system validation. So that's sort of checking for required fields, both in the UI and the database. Looking at field formats. You know, if it's an email field, it's got to have an @ sign in it, looking at foreign keys and stuff like that. But we're really only going to do that if the request is coming from the UI. I think we always do the foreign key thing. We've simplified this a little bit. Then we get the bit where we'll run any before save record triggered flows first, those little fast field update blighters, and then we'll run any before save Apex triggers. But flows will be run first. But they both sort of happen almost coincidentally at that green blob there. Then we're going to run most system validation again, and this is the point where custom validation rules are run. They're executed there. So we're always going to do that. Most system validation means we're not going to do things like check for required fields in the page layout. We've done that on blob number 2. We're not going to do that on blob number 4 here. And then if you're using them, you know, if you've got any duplicate management going on, we're going to do that there. Now here's a scenario for you. Riddle me this. A user saves maybe one of those delivery records. So we start coming around this, you know, this circular graphic. So we do blob number 1, this guy. We do blob number 2, the record passes system validation. So it's happy there. And then it says a before trigger is executed. It doesn't say whether that's an Apex or a flow, could be either really. And then, oh dear, at blob number 4, system validation fails. So what's the most likely culprit there? What's probably happened? What say you? What can you do? I mentioned it briefly. Yeah, you can mess with the inbound data. So some over-enthusiastic developer has done something like blank out a required field or stuff something into an email that doesn't look like an email. So that's caught at that step there. So providing none of that bad stuff happens, we do actually get to the save. And then we start looking at, well, what happens after the save? Well, Then we'll look at any after-save Apex triggers. That's the next step, of course, if there are any. And then, we still have workflow rules. They still exist, don't they? There's probably tens, hundreds of thousands of these things still in action. I know we can't create them anymore, but they don't go away. People are still using them. So these will be evaluated there. Now, when I'm teaching, I would challenge you, what are the 4 things you can do in a workflow rule? So if you can do it real quick, 4 things you can do with a workflow rule. Update a field. Email. Outbound message. And the difficult 4th album? Create a task. Yeah, well done, well done. Now, if that workflow rule updates a field on this record, and that value actually changes, and this is what most people were using workflow rules for, you get this happening, okay? You would get any before update Apex triggers running again. You would get system validation again, no custom validation. We'd save the record again, and then we will get any after update Apex triggers running again. This is the reason why Salesforce is keen for us to move off workflow rules, because of the overhead of doing a field update on this record, because you're going to get all that gubbins running again when you probably don't want it. So much more efficient, if you can do something like that, to do it at the green blob here with either Apex or preferably a record triggered flow these days, if it's simple enough. Okay? And it gets worse because this Apex code here could mess with a record, and it might cause other workflow rules to go around that little triangle. Okay? Then, processes with Process Builder. They're not going away, they're still there. So I'm not sure I can remember all the things you can do with a process here. But one of the things you can do is you can update a field on this record. So if you were doing that with the process, it gets worse. You get this thing going on. You would get the 4 update Apex triggers running again. You would get system, and this time you would get custom validation here. We'll save the record again. We'll run Apex again. We might even run workflow rules again here, God help you. And it's much worse because I don't know if you remember in processes, there was that little cheeky checkbox, that one that says allow recursion. Remember that one? The devil's checkbox. So if you did that, it's possible you may have gone around this whole thing multiple times. The system will stop you. I think it allows a maximum of 6, and it'll just give up and move on with its life. But potentially huge overhead. So again, if you were using just a process to do an update, which a lot of people were, but it tends to be a bit more interesting with processes, though, you've got that huge overhead happening where maybe you didn't want it. We're not done yet. So then we would do, this is when we look at after-save record triggered flows, what they call actions and related records in here. Now you can do, again, pretty much anything with an after-save record triggered flow. You could update a field on this record. You get the idea here. So if you did that, we've got one of them little triangles with Apex, system custom validation, saving it, and more Apex. So unless there's a really good reason, don't update a field on the record with an after-save record triggered flow. You might have to, and if you need the ID, you've got no choice, take the hit. But otherwise, try and consider anyway, doing it in one of those fast field update jobs. Then, this is when we look at roll-up summary calculations and cross-object workflows, doing an update on a parent record. That happens there. I'm going to come back to that. If you've got anything that affects sharing rules, criteria-based sharing rules, you've messed the record, we need to recalculate the sharing table, that's going to happen there. And if we get through all of that lot, with no bad karma, then we will eventually commit our change permanently, and there is some post-commit logic as well as part of this. Okay. Now, let's come back to that bit. Okay. So maybe this is a detail record in a master detail, and we realize we need to reach up to the master record and do one of those roll-up summary jobs in here. So what's going to happen is you're modifying another record. You get another order of execution on that parent record with everything we've been talking about on that parent record. You don't get that, though, okay? There is only ever one place where we commit all changes, at the end of the initial order of execution. I like to use the analogy, the Lord of the Rings movie. I don't know how many, I'm a fan. The Lord of the Rings movie, the one ring to rule them all, and in the darkness bind them, okay? That initial order of execution, it's the one ring, because it carries that commit point and any post-commit logic that's needed. And in fact, anything that does another DML, data manipulation language, insert, update, delete, undelete, anything that does one of those before we get to that final commit point, like you might be adding an account record, and maybe you build a record-triggered flow to add a child contact record, which would be a sensible thing to do. It's not unreasonable. It's going to generate another order of execution. If you get carried away with your automation, you're going to end up with more rings than the Olympics here going on. So you get to see the size of what we would call transaction can be enormous, and it can be quite complicated to understand what the hell is going on in here. If something bad happens, heaven forfend, but if something bad happens, so let's say in that scenario, we've got some Apex developer who hasn't come on one of our training courses, has been a bit careless, and has allowed an uncaught exception at this point. They've divided by 0 or something goofy, or looked at a null pointer, I don't know, could be anything really. So if that happens, we've saved our account record here, we've saved our contact record here, but we've got a problem there. Okay. What do you think is going to happen? Are we going to lose just the contact, or are we going to lose the contact and the account? We chuck the whole thing away? What's your feeling there? What would you hope to happen? Yeah, we chuck it all away, okay? So bad karma, we lose the lot, okay? Anything nasty that happens before we get to the commit point, we're going to chuck everything away. No matter how many rings and saves and goodness knows what else you've done in there, it's going to throw it all away. Now, I did try and summarize this here. We use this circular graphic to sort of teach people this stuff. And there was a number of reasons we did it. We tried a number of ways, and you've probably seen diagrams all over the place about the order of execution. If you look at the documentation, it's a list. Nobody can remember that. If you look at the architect's guide, they've got quite a nice like a flow chart now, which goes into quite a lot of detail, which is good, but difficult to get into your head. What we found is switching to this sort of these circular, these rings here, people can, well, maybe it depends on the way your brain works, but people can remember that, and you can use that to actually draw out quite complicated transactions. So I tried to summarize it here. We missed out a few steps. There's a couple of steps, 4 of them, that I missed out because they really only apply to just a few standard objects, cases and leads and stuff like that. So I put them in here in red and tried to summarize the rest of this in one place in here. The other thing you have to think about it is a single unit of work. All of that, all of those rings, it's one transaction. One transaction. If you were here for the previous session with Tom, it's always a bit daunting to run a session after an architect like that. You know that we're kind of fussy about transactions. We apply governor limits, or one of my colleagues doesn't like to call them governor limits. He likes to call them efficiency limits, because if you don't obey them, if you don't write efficient code, you're going to have a problem on this platform. So we apply these hard limits to a transaction, no matter how big or how small that transaction is. It has to fit within these hard limits. And there have been pretty basic ones, like memory consumption, number of times you can query the database. But Apex code is vulnerable to governor limits, and so are flows, particularly flows. You do a get records element in a flow, you're consuming a governor limit. you update or create a record in a flow, you're consuming governor limits. Flows are as vulnerable to governor limits as Apex code is. So if you're a flow developer, you should be thinking about governor limits in the same way that we teach Apex developers to do that. So if I go back to that original scenario I threw at you guys a little bit earlier, here's the data model. We've got automation up here, we've got some automation down here. I modified that, the master record in here just by updating it, changing a single field, and that initiated some automation. So there are some build effects here. I did an update on that guy. So that started the one ring, okay, the order of execution on that parent, on that master record. So I had an after-save Apex trigger, some Apex code. That was the one that's supposed to reach down and sort of mess around with the two child records in here. So what that guy did, it did an update on one of those delivery guys. Okay, so we have an order of execution on that. No commit or anything else on here. And by the way, I forgot to talk about the post-commit stuff, so I'll come back to that. But we've got one of those things happening down here. Okay? Now that the automation on this would have kicked off. So we had a before save trigger, have to be an Apex trigger on that guy. So you saw that this is harking back to that picture I showed you of the log file. We then had a workflow rule. It evaluated, didn't do anything, but you could see it being evaluated in the log. Okay. Then we got to the roll-up summary bit. This thing realized, master detail, I've got some roll-up summary fields there. I think they're doing things like counting the number of deliveries in a cancelled state or something like that. So that initiated an update on the parent record. So guess what? We got one of those things running on the parent in here. Okay? And it's an order of execution, so all the automation would have kicked off. And you see, there's the second occurrence of that trigger on that parent record. So this little guy down here. Okay. And because we had designed the code here particularly badly, and again deliberately, because then we get the Apex developers to fix it, we actually saw that thing happen twice. Okay, normally you would not, if it was properly bulkified, you wouldn't see that happening a second time. But because we wrote rubbish code deliberately, you do see that happening again. So this whole 9 yards on the left in here was repeated a second time. So you see again that third invocation of that trigger on that parent object. So I don't know if this convinces you, but I think it's a reasonable tool for writing out and drawings, get on a bit of paper what can happen in even sometimes a quite complex transaction. If you understand what the blobs mean, you understand the one ring, you understand where the sort of DML or inserts, updates, deletes, undeletes are happening, you can sketch this out. I think reasonably easily. I don't know what your opinion is. For me, it works. I have this in my head now. If I'm looking at a transaction, I'm going to start drawing circles. My wife thinks I'm crazy on a bit of paper to try and understand what went on. So I'm just going to go back real quick here because I forgot to mention one thing. So I'll give you a psychotic moment by going back through all these build effects to this picture here. The post-commit bit, I just forgot to mention in here. What happens after that bit, there is some action. So if any of that automation, if you've sent an email from a workflow, process, flow, Apex, it doesn't go immediately. It's sort of queued and only goes after that commit point. Same thing for outbound messages. We can do those from flows now. If you've got any asynchronous Apex calling at future methods, or if you've got any asynchronous flows, again, they're going to be queued only after we get to the part get past that commit point. Same thing for things like some of the streaming events, platform events, change data capture events, that kind of stuff. it's only going to happen if we've successfully passed the commit point. So if it blows up before we get to that commit point, none of that stuff is going to be sent out into the outside world. So I'm going to have to go back through the build effects now because, sorry, do it real quick. So that's what I have to say about the save order of execution. I don't know if that made any sense to you guys, but I'm certainly, and actually reasonably ahead of time here because I've got 10 minutes left. So I talked a little bit quicker than I thought I would. But questions? Do you have any questions on that?
Slightly long-winded question. And I've had exchanges with sales engineering about this in the past. Coming from other platforms, considering that Salesforce, a lot of the design happens with the domain first. Like, you design the domain first, and then you have a checkbox to run a process, to run automation, which again hooks into how the platform is designed. Most of your automation runs off of the domain save, which means you need a box to drive a process. Right? And coming from other platforms, particularly ones that are API first, you think about the API first and then you design code for the API. Whereas here, you do the domain first and then you have boxes to drive processes or statuses in your example. Is there any work or thinking happening inside Salesforce to perhaps move towards the API first design rather than the domain first?
I'm not super sure I understand what you mean by an API first design.
So let's say there's a hypothetical scenario where you book an order and a case record has to be created.
Yeah.
Now, in Salesforce, it's very usual to have a status on the order, which automates the case creation part.
Mm-hmm.
Now, on other platforms, there'd be like an API, a composite API that does the order first and then also, also creates the case. In Salesforce, because you get native object APIs baked in as part of the domain, you don't think about APIs, right? Like you add a field, you get an API for it. You see where I'm going with this?
Yeah.
So people don't think about APIs, they just add fields for everything they want. So they have a box that says new case, right? Yeah. Or whatever, right? So I spoke to Christian, I don't know, Christian in Salesforce, and he said there's some internal thinking going on about.
Yeah, possibly. But I've got to tell you, in the instructor community, you'd find out about it probably before we did. I mean, there are some things you can do. I mean, you can think there are composite APIs which will actually do what you talked about, or you can actually just create your own. You can expose, let's say, Apex services that will do what you need to do.
You have 50 entry points for Apex. You can call Apex in 50 different ways.
Yeah.
But all of it is tedious to do to expose it as APIs. The easiest way to get an API for free is to create a field, right?
Yeah. Well, you do have APIs for free, but you're right, they are fairly limited in what they can do. Although, actually, you can do some clever things with composite. And Fabienne's talking about GraphQL shortly, which also might be interesting for you to have a look at. I'm going to go to his session on that later on this afternoon. So I don't have a good answer for you, really, I'm afraid. Yeah.
First of all, I thought the graphs were the diagrams were really clear. Thank you. But question about the roll-up summary fields and recalculating. Will they always recalculate on the master object, regardless of what the update was on the child?
No, only if they need to change. Only if the actual recalculation decides we do need to change the value, would you get the save happening on the master.
Just a side effect that happens.
No, it only does it if it really needs to do it, but it is going to do it. So understanding the ramifications of that. Because what was happening, and one of the reasons we did all of this, is because, one of my colleagues used to work in support before he saw the lights and became an instructor. And he was getting calls on a Monday morning from customers complaining that Salesforce broke over the weekend. They were getting governor limit exceptions, and they hadn't made any code changes, so Salesforce was obviously broken. So usually if you get something on a Monday morning, the suspicion is, well, what usually happens over the weekend, you do some sort of deployment, don't you? So with a bit of questioning, often it would surface, well, did you do anything? Yeah, we changed the workflow rule. We added a workflow rule, updated a field. that doesn't affect governor limits, doesn't it? Well, actually it does, because you see those little triangles. You can see the fact that if you do anything like that, any sort of DML operation, it's going to affect the order of execution. It expanded the size of the transaction. They probably did it directly in the production system, because you can. They didn't do it in a sandbox and tested it, and they must have been pretty close to the old governor limit there, and it just pushed them over the edge. So an understanding of the implications of doing even simple stuff like that on the size of the transaction and the implications that it can have.
If you ship code that is already pretty close to the governor limits, you're basically restricting your customers from adding their own workflows and stuff too.
Well, you shouldn't be doing it in production. You know, the idea is you do it in sandbox, and if there is a problem, you're going to find out about it there. You know, it's crazy to make changes like that. You know, we stop you writing Apex code in production, don't we? Because you just can't do it. But we don't stop you changing any of the other automation tools, so it's a risk that you have to take. It's the best practice, I think.
Thank you.
Any other? Yeah.
I think looking at the example you bring up between two object collision just now, if I try to solve that on the flow perspective,
Yeah.
I would create a loop process that I'll get all the information, assign it, and then finally update it, right?
Yeah.
Where can I visualize the loop process in your Lord of the Ring diagram?
Well, the same thing applies. You know, it depends on, I suppose, how you're initiating it. But remember, flows are just part of the order of execution. So if you were doing something like we were doing there, not with an Apex after save Apex trigger, but with an after save record triggered flow, it would be the same thing. Okay, really, there would be little difference here. The only advantage you would get in a flow is flows are automatically bulkified. So our messed up Apex code where you saw those two specific deliveries being updated, you probably wouldn't see that in a flow because the flow would automatically bulkify what they call automatic bulkification of DML operations. So it would be actually difficult to screw it up with a record triggered flow like we deliberately make the developers do. Okay, if you're going to bulkify Apex, you design it like that here. You can still mess up in flows, of course. You can still put things inside loops and below limits, you know, to your heart's content. But that particular example, not quite so devastating, perhaps. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
So in addition to developer tools, was there any other tools you could recommend to help us monitor this?
Well, I'm sure there are third-party tools out there which I'm not privy to. You know, log files are a pain because they are awful to read. You know, and also, in a production system, you probably don't have logging turned on, nor should you, because it's an overhead. So monitoring what's going on, there's tools out there. I'm not that familiar with them. There's, what do we call it? Salesforce. There's one that has event, I can't remember the name off the top of my head here. Does anyone help me out here? It's Salesforce. Could be Shield, it's part of Shield. There's event monitoring as part of that here. Also, custom error logging. You know, don't rely on system.debug, for God's sake. You know, start doing custom error logging if you want to trap errors, or you perhaps even use it to log, you know, progress. Think about creating custom, you know, we teach people to, yes, rely on things like debug logs in the developer environment, but when you go to production, don't do that unless you really have to. Create a custom object or something and write your errors to that. You know, you want it to robust, you want it to make sure that you still capture the error, use a platform event. Use a publish immediate platform event to do that. There's even, I think, little things on App Exchange, Force Panda, I think, tells you how to do that, or you can just write your own. You come on Apex training, we teach you to do that, because it's robust error logging. You know, you want to absolutely make sure you capture what's going on. And you could even build your own tracking into that if you wanted to. So there's always loads of ways to do things on Salesforce, aren't there? Some of them you can write, and some of them you can get from App Exchange. Probably the guys circulating around here will have some examples for you.
There's an extension called Apex Log Analyzer by Financial Force.
Yeah.
Certinia, formerly Financial Force. That's available. I work for them.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. So roll your own, or probably get a Rolls-Royce solution from the likes of these guys.
It's free.
Yeah.
It's really available extension.
Yeah.
Called Apex Log Analyzer.
So I think that's it. I think I've come to... Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Anthony from DSelect. And what is DSelect as a platform? It is essentially a way to enable marketers that use the Salesforce Marketing Cloud to get more out of their data. DSelect serves both non-technical marketers, for instance those who do not know how to write SQL queries, as well as technical marketers who are very well versed in the platform but who are looking for ways to be more efficient or who just want to enable their less technical colleagues. DSelect is an official Salesforce Marketing Cloud partner that offers the leading marketing data enablement platform on AppExchange. Fortune 500 leaders and mid-sized businesses leverage DSelect's intuitive solutions to help marketing teams create more powerful, segmented audiences, control marketing communication frequency, and achieve faster Marketing Cloud ROI without code or technical dependencies.